Well, I think there are indications that counterattacks are happening and that Russian prisoners are being taken in those counterattacks. But it's where those reserves are coming from the Ukrainian side, which will have a potential impact elsewhere. If you have to take resources from somewhere else on your front line to contain something which can be operationally significant, that also potentially gives you a gap somewhere else through which the Russians can penetrate. And there are at least three parts of the front where Zelensky says that the Russians are active and seeking a breakthrough. That is the problem that the Ukrainians face, with potentially a shortage of manpower in certain areas, and what was an impenetrable drone war because of the both the EW electronic warfare and these the fiber optic drones, which I've talked about from the Russian sides, make it more problematic for the Ukrainians at the moment than it would have been a couple of months ago. Operationally decisive, no. Strategically decisive, no. Tactical gains, absolutely.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we're catching up with Major General Chapman, who served for 33 years in the British military. He was a platoon commander in the Falklands conflict, has commanded 2 para and was British military advisor to US Central Command. He's also a regular analyst with us on the war in Ukraine on Frontline. Good to see you again, Chip. Thanks for joining us today. What a time we're talking in as well. Can I just get you to start by, as you see it, describing this moment for President Zelensky, the pressures he faces, the leader of a country fighting for its survival while being shut out of the very discussions between the aggressor and the leader of the inverted commas free world?
Well, there are two pressures on him, I think, at the moment. The first one is the battlefield pressures about what is going on, particularly in Donetsk, whether the sword is mightier than the shield at the moment, particularly in the advances we're seeing in around the Pokrovsk area, which we'll talk about. And secondly, the diplomatic pressures on him, where you never know with the mercurial mind of Trump whether he is in a spectrum of admiration towards Putin or condemnation towards Putin, and where that will lead. I mean, a week in politics is always a long time. It was only on the 8th of August that we expected there to be secondary sanctions of 100% on those consuming Russian oil, which may have at some stage helped to collapse the Russian economy. Now we've had this complete turnaround from President Trump at the moment, where he's going to meet Putin, which is actually a reward in the first place, because it's worth remembering that Putin has been sanctioned by the International Criminal Court. So that will be played as a reward in itself by the Russian media, which, of course, in an authoritarian state like Russia, is a win in itself. And neither do I think that Putin is likely to concede anything. An advancing army, which they are at the moment, rarely makes concessions when their opponent is about to become potentially diplomatically weaker. But in terms of leadership, we always say that leadership has two vectors. It has character and competence. And I think throughout the last 3.5 years, Zelensky has shown immense character, which is why he's universally admired, I think, in the West.
And on those pressures on the battlefield, Chip, Russia appears to be in a rush to make gains ahead of the talks with Trump in Alaska. What can you tell us from what you're seeing about the developments along the front line in eastern Ukraine, the so-called tactical penetrations?
I don't think it's necessarily a rush for this moment, because it's only been, we've only known about this for a week, but it's always been an operational objective of Russia to seize the remainder of Donetsk by the end of 2025. Generally, most people still think that that is not something which is feasible and can't be done. And indeed, until recently, we've said that at the current rate of advance, that it will take until at least sort of February 28 for Russia to seize the whole of the four sort of oblasts at the rate they're going. What's changed really in the last few days, in a sense, is the rate of advance has got greater, and at the moment there is it's not being contained and destroyed. Now, we have to put this in context, though. We generally talk about the fact that we're looking for a Russian breakthrough. Is this an operational breakthrough? Because tactical battles are always sequenced in terms of operational objectives. No, it's not. And what you've really got to describe it using a visual, you've got 2 fingers worth of penetrations, which are fairly linear. What you'd want the Russians to do if they were to be really successful is to do what Little Hart called the expanding torrent. So those 2 fingers become this sort of fan, and it breaks and expands out. And that is when you develop a breakthrough into a real operational penetration. And that operational penetration would be in terms of either enveloping Konstantinivka or Pokrovsk and interdicting the H20 highway. That is the highway, an arc really from Sloviansk around to Konstantinivka, which is where the sort of fortress belt of the Ukrainians are. Now, is that going to be unraveled in short order because of this penetration? No, it's not. Could it be unraveled in short order if there was a diplomatic move to give those 2 oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk away to the Russians? Yes, it could, because this is what we call vital ground of such significance that losing it either militarily or diplomatically in some sort of settlement would absolutely unhinge that part of the front of Ukrainian defence.
And what is the state of the Ukrainian defences along this part of the front line? And why are Russian forces able to get through?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. And again, it's really to do with this sword and shield and how developments happen. So the first thing is that the currency that we used to talk about in the early days of the war from the Russian perspective was a maneuver element called battalion tactical groups. This was a sort of all-armed grouping with, engineers, tanks, infantry, air defence, which would be the exploitation echelon if you had a number of them, which could go and do great things and unhinge the Ukrainian defence and get to Kyiv in the Thunder Run in 3 to 5 days. That, as a currency of warfare, has gone with the attrition which has gone on the Russian side. So what we've really seen is this new infiltration and sabotage tactic. And this is where you have this sort of really quite small groupings of folk on motorbikes, quad bikes, things like that, searching for weaknesses in the Ukrainian defense. Where you find that weakness, you penetrate, try and break through in a small way, and then flood people through and try and consolidate that and expand that. It's really a bit like how we talk about water, gaps and surfaces, that the water always finds a gap. The Russians find that gap, try and get through that gap, consolidate and break out. Now, why are they able to do that, and what is the pounding of the cities which is going on at the moment? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, it's more difficult for the Ukrainians to bring both reserves and logistics up to the front line, and that is because of the Russian ability at the moment to conduct battlefield air interdiction on the routes to the battlefield. And they're able to do that because they're using more extended range drones, particularly fiber optic drones, which are more resistant to electronic warfare. And indeed, they seem to be at the moment winning the electronic warfare battle at the tactical level at the moment. Added to that, you've got the extended range which the Russians have been using of their glide bombs, turning dumb bombs, the FAB bombs, into the equivalent of US JDAM bombs, satellite guided, onto precision targets, which are really malleting quite badly the defensive positions of the Ukrainians. Now, it's a number of those which are significant. So, for example, there were 160 glide bomb attacks on the Donetsk front in July. That is 8 times more than, for example, in 2023. So a number of these tactical innovations, really, by the Russians mean that you've got this eroding stalemate. Now, that's a phrase I've used a number of times over the last few years. The erosion has always been quite slow. It still is quite slow, but in terms of what we used to talk about, the glacial pace of this operation, because the transparency of the battlefield meant that, a village was being taken for 1,000 casualties. And indeed, there is no operational and strategic sense in the casualties for the number of villages and amount of ground taken. And that is still true. But in a authoritarian state, casualties don't necessarily matter to you. So all those things together mean that Ukraine is in a worse position than it was sort of 6 weeks ago. Is that necessarily going to unhinge things? Not necessarily. So we had the Ramstein format in mid-July, which aimed to further arm the Ukrainians in a 50-day drive to push Ukraine to the Putin to the negotiating table. Do I think he's going to go to the negotiating table? No. What he will do is he will engage, he will flatter, but he'll sort of push things to the right, because battlefield success has its own mark, and there's no reason for him to negotiate at the moment. And there's also no reason for Ukraine to give in, because they're not weak enough to give away their sovereignty. That creates a haunted dilemma for Trump in trying to arrange a settlement. So things are looking worse than they did for Ukraine. Is it operationally significant? Not necessarily so at the moment. If you ask me in a month's time, that may have changed. We'll see if it can be contained and defeated. The Azov Corps are heading towards there. If they could be interdicted by the Russians in this battlefield air interdiction that I talked about, things might be more difficult. But at the moment, that fortress belt holds. And whilst that hold, the situation on Donetsk is still means it's going to be under Ukrainian control.
So can you just tell us a little bit more about the fortress belt? You say it's holding. What if it doesn't? How important is it?
Well, it's absolutely important in terms of Donetsk. It's not absolutely important in terms of a war-winning maneuver. So in terms of how wars are won, you can win by decisive military action, or by the other side giving in, or by not having decisive military action. It will be a decisive operational level action. It will unhinge Donetsk. It will not be a decisive strategic action, because you still have the ability in Ukraine to trade space for time. We're still nowhere near the Dnieper River, for example, and we're still, it's still 20% of Ukraine in Russian hands, whereas in March 2022 it was 30%. So they're in a worse position from a Russian perspective than they were over 3 years ago. They could change that calculus, but it's not going to be a war-ending move.
You mentioned earlier about these penetrations being 2 at the moment, and it has to fan out into several more to become something more significant. Do you think it has been contained? Do you know what's happened to those troops? And are there any signs that Russia is trying to build up some more simultaneous attacks along different parts of the front line?
Well, I think there are indications that counterattacks are happening and that Russian prisoners are being taken in those counterattacks. But it's where those reserves are coming from the Ukrainian side, which will have a potential impact elsewhere. If you have to take resources from somewhere else on your front line to contain something which can be operationally significant, that also potentially gives you a gap somewhere else through which the Russians can penetrate. And there are at least 3 parts of the front where Zelensky says that the Russians are active and seeking a breakthrough. That is the problem that the Ukrainians face, with potentially a shortage of manpower in certain areas, and what was an impenetrable drone war because of the both the EW electronic warfare and these the fiber optic drones, which I've talked about from the Russian sides, make it more problematic for the Ukrainians at the moment than it would have been a couple of months ago. Operationally decisive, no. Strategically decisive, no. Tactical gains, absolutely.
According to reported comments by a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard, Bohdan Krochevich, the problem in this part of Donetsk has been escalating since last year, and warnings were ignored. What is the problem? I mean, is this lack of manpower? Is it lack of communication? What do you think is going wrong?
Well, all those things could be true. I mean, we just don't really have enough visibility on those things to say. But, as I said, if, the chicken pecks grain by grain has always been that sort of Russian philosophy that ultimately, big battalions win or numerical numbers win. The Russians have more. I wouldn't sort of say that has to be decisive, because all wars probably in this era will end by negotiations. It's okay saying that those warnings were ignored. That that fortress belt has been there since 2014. It's been developed since then. The Russians haven't penetrated it to any great detail since. Neither do I think that in the terms of the number and the expanse of this breakthrough, it is that significant at the moment. But it's significant, of course, in the way it's reported. And it's reported at this particular time because all wars are fought three times. Firstly, on the battlefield, secondly, in memory, and thirdly, in the information space. And the timing of this, of course, is playing absolutely into that information space, where if you were to flip this from what Trump, for example, said in February this year, when he said to Ukraine, you've got no cards to play. From a Russian perspective, and Putin talking to Trump, he might well say, they've got no cards to play. I absolutely agree. Putin might say that there should be a ceasefire as a humanitarian act, but he will frame it as, if you give me the 4+1, the 4 oblasts plus Crimea, there will be an immediate ceasefire tomorrow. That would, of course, be unacceptable from a Ukrainian perspective, and is absolutely unacceptable from a European perspective. And that was the line which the Europeans and Zelensky were telling Trump yesterday in their virtual meeting.
If what Putin attains is less than that, we know that he wants the whole of the Donbas. If he does take Donetsk, what new challenges would that present in the defense of Ukraine, assuming that the battle continues?
Well, it would enable them to exploit further to create what they would say is a zone into the next oblast, and that is less defensible. So it would be easier to exploit further if you took, for example, Pokrovsk and the next Donbas as no defensible terrain. That doesn't, again, mean that Ukraine has lost, and it then comes back down to these concepts of what is a territory which you can give back or not, and whether you look at the concepts of what de jure or de facto control of a territory means. I mean, Ukraine is not going to sign away its territory. Russia is not going to give back those territories because it's already signed it into law in the Duma in 2023. If Russia were to give those back, that would also create a political dilemma for Putin, because technically from his side, they are now also Russian territories. They're not Ukrainian territories, in the same way that for Zelensky, constitutionally, they are Ukrainian territories. And that's where potentially a way to unlock this. I'm not suggesting it is a good way, neither do I think it's going to be a tenable way. That's where this notion of de facto control, something you don't recognize in law, can be different than de jure when you have signed away those rights constitutionally. And there is a little bit of a historical lesson here, because, for example, one of the things that we often talk about in international relations at the moment and threats is, of course, in the Suwalki corridor towards Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad, of course, was Königsberg until 1945. The Germans never signed that away and their right to Königsberg until the 2+4 agreement, which unified Germany in 1990. So one of the ways you could unpick this, again, I'm not saying it's a just peace or any of that sort of stuff, is by freezing that. Again, I think that would be in a frozen peace would be in the interests of Putin, and then kick this down the road in terms of looking at it in 49 years' time or 99 years' time, which has been some of the ways that they did in terms of that the future of Germany from 1945 onwards.
Do you think President Putin has any interest in a ceasefire at the moment?
No, I don't. But he will play Trump along because he doesn't want to incur the wrath of Trump. So no, I don't think he's got any interest in a ceasefire at the moment. The thing about Putin is he's been very, very consistent. We all know that President Trump is very inconsistent. You don't know what his mercurial mind is going to do from one week to the next. And as I said, where he is on this spectrum of giving a hard time to Zelensky and not giving a hard time to Putin, or vice versa. That's flip-flopped around the bazaars all the time. One thing about Putin is he has been consistent in what the political demands of Russia are, and wars are always fought for political objectives, and those include, as we've all seen, that Ukraine gives up the 4 oblasts plus Crimea. that it will never join NATO again, and that it should be demilitarized and denazified. Now, what he actually means by that is that Ukraine becomes a vassal state of Russia, and that Ukraine essentially loses its sovereignty for the future. That is a surrender peace. And so when people talk about peace, you have to understand, I think, what are the qualifying words that come before that. So from a Ukrainian perspective and a European perspective, that is a surrender peace. Putin would frame that as a stable peace, only looking at the root causes, as he's also been consistent of in this war. Will a final peace come? The root causes and his consistency there is that the Central Europe should be in the sphere of influence of Putin, because the real grand strategic objective of Putin is to regain lost territory in spheres of influence. That is not just Ukraine, it's wider than that.
Do you think right now, sort of on the eve of these talks in Alaska, how great is the danger towards the future of European security? How much is that at stake?
Well, it's absolutely at stake in terms of if you look at the concept of a just peace, for example, the just peace often said by Guterres and the UN General Secretary is that a just peace is underpinned by three things. Firstly, the UN Charter, Article 2, brackets 4, closed brackets, demands that no territory should be taken by force, and that there is a sovereign inviolability of every country. If you give a tick to the utility of force, that you can alter those boundaries by force, then you're overturning what has been the framework of Europe since 1945, which is the futility of force. So it's where you stand on the futility of force versus utility of force spectrum, which is the key strategic determinant in international relations terms here. Now, that's the worry for Europe. Now, Europe, of course, has been its own worst enemy in terms of riding on the coattails of the US in terms of the hegemonic power. A lot of countries not standing up to the plate in terms of their defense budgets and things like that. I mean, they are getting in the real world with the last NATO conference with the desire to raise GDP to 5%. But like all these things, it's really to do with political will as much as anything. And that's the big difference between Putin and some of the European powers, that Putin absolutely has a consistent civilizational will that Russia will regain these territories. He doesn't look at it in terms of a election cycle like the West. He looks at this as a divine civilizational Russian right, and that is measured in grand strategic terms, not in an election cycle, not necessarily in 10 years or a decade. It could be 20 years or 100 years. They're a patient, revanchist, imperial power. It's that recognition of that which is the missing bit from some of President Trump's perspective. But he does want, and has been consistent in my view, in what he would call a humanitarian peace. I truly believe that he does want to stop the killing. The problem with that is that it rewards the aggressor unless it goes towards that just peace part of the spectrum of what is peace.
And to that point, I mean, what can Europe actually do in this situation? Because it may be presented with the choice of choosing between keeping on side with the US and supporting Ukraine if Ukraine is being put under pressure to accept some kind of agreement which is unacceptable to it.
Well, peace in Europe has only really been ever kept by two basic premises. It's either by a balance of power or by what used to be called the concert of Europe. That was the model which gave us the long enduring peace from the end of the Napoleonic Wars onwards. What changed that was a divergence in terms of nationalism and other pressures. And it's that divergence that we're really seeing at the moment potentially between Europe and America. I mean, I think Europe was pretty consistent and spoke with one voice when it had its virtual meeting with Donald Trump. And European demands are pretty clear, it seems to me. Ukraine needs security guarantees so that even if you did, in de facto terms, give away some of the Ukrainian territory, there would be some trigger for a collective action against Russia were it to break any sort of ceasefire or peace agreement. Secondly, Ukraine should be part of the negotiations, as should Europe, because that's where the territory is. The agency should lie with Ukraine and Europe. You can't do a deal with America and Russia because they're not the ones who sit on that sort of land. It's also been a consistent point from Europe that you should have a ceasefire first and then negotiations. That's been a sticking point for Putin. He says that you should have negotiations first, then a ceasefire. He sees a ceasefire as a precondition, and that has also always been a way that he can kick the can down the road. Even if Trump were to say there should be an immediate ceasefire tomorrow, I'll almost guarantee that Putin will say there are a number of technical difficulties that we would need to examine by doing this, and that would kick the can down the road, and he'd find those technical difficulties in the same way that those were the sort of technical difficulties or lack of trust and confidence building measures that upended Minsk I and Minsk II, which were the prior attempts to do this under the French, for example, 4 or 5 years ago.
There was a little bit of a revival of the talk of the coalition of the willing yesterday when Sir Keir Starmer, on Wednesday that is, when Sir Keir Starmer met with French and German counterparts, said it's ready to implement its military plans in a post-war Ukraine as soon as a peace deal is in place. And he said there's real progress on security guarantees for Ukraine. And there seems to be a new prospect of this reassurance force on the table, or assurance force. Isn't this, I mean, how significant is this? Is this a little bit of a positive sideshow to what's really going on? Is he putting the cart before the horse? Or are these important things that do need to be talked about, but more flesh put on the bones?
Well, I don't think they will be talked about tomorrow. I think they are important in giving security guarantees as part of any peace deal. But really, there's a spectrum here that we're talking about. One of the things that Putin might do is offer a truce of 2 or 3 days. There's a difference between a truce, a ceasefire, an armistice, and a peace settlement, as there is a difference between conflict termination, conflict resolution, and conflict reconciliation. We're nowhere near, in my view, a ceasefire. If Putin is going to offer something, it would be a very time-limited truce, probably, but there will not be conflict termination in its true sense, and we're nowhere near any conflict resolution, and we can all get around and discuss kumbaya politics around a campfire. We're still a long way from that in 2025, in my view.
Could you just walk us through those different definitions? Because they're often misreported, aren't they, in the media?
Well, actually, the only one which has any real legal definition in international law is a truce, which is normally established for a limited period for specific reasons. That is, for example, things like for humanitarian aid to be got in or for wounded people to be taken out. And that was the sort of Russian model, really, in Syria, which, of course, they often broke when they then went and bombed places again. So a ceasefire has a different resonance. A armistice really freezes a conflict. It doesn't lead to any particular settlement. And, of course, that's why we still have no conflict resolution, for example, following the Korean War in 1953. And the Korean War in 1953 is an interesting one to look at, of course, because it did take 200 rounds of negotiations and 2 years to get to an armistice, not a peace settlement. And of course, a number of armed troops on either side of the 38th parallel in Korea is still vast because there's still no conflict resolution or final conflict termination. And that is the problem here. I don't think we're going to get conflict termination when you still have those grand strategic objectives of Putin. That should lead you, from a Western perspective, to say the only way to really unlock this is for Putin to be defeated, strategically defeated. If you can't do that on the battlefield, you can do it by the implosion of the economy, or by the fact that the soldiers walk off the battlefield, or by the populist uprising. It's very difficult to do the latter because of the authoritarian nature of the media at the moment. But you can't falsify the economy forever, and that's probably one of the reasons why the impact of secondary sanctions may have been very great. Of course, there are ways around that, and we've seen that with the Russian use of the shadow fleet, for example, in selling oil to India and China in particular. And that's one of the potential points of leverage. China doesn't want Russia to lose, but neither does it want to be imploded with the lack of access to Russian oil. So there are still many, many variables in the future of this.
So just taking a step back then, what do you think those talks in Alaska can actually achieve? And what might the biggest consequences be?
Well, I think it will do no more than set the table for a future meeting. And that's been one of the problems at the moment. There was this notion, particularly, I think, 6 months ago or so, from General Kellogg, that you'd say to Putin, come to the table or we'll give unequivocal support, militarily, financial, and sanction support to Ukraine. And at the same time saying to Zelensky, come to the table or we'll give you no support. That sort of position, which we saw with the caveating of intelligence support and military support after the spat in the White House in February. That really teased the thing up for the table. The problem with Trump is we don't know what the configuration of the table is from a sort of week to week basis. And so I think it will just set the table for a secondary meeting, unless again, Trump has a meltdown and unequivocally blames Putin. I don't think he will do that. And I think that's because, as I said, Putin is a clever guy, schooled in the KGB, who will have done lots of human factors analysis on what Trump is like and how to engage with him in a meeting. So he will engage, he will flatter, but if you've got the EF, the G would then be he will then follow the Gromyko thing, which Kaja Kallas says all the time, that he will give nothing. He will demand the maximum and give nothing, but will give the impression to Trump that he's giving something by the engagement and flattery.
Chip Chapman, always good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. If you'd like to know more about the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe and sign up for a membership. You can also get more analysis by listening to Times Radio or read thetimes.com. But for now, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.